they called it justice. The Lycanthian court sentenced Nora Bellwyn to spend one night in the dungeon cell with the feral wolf, the beast that had killed 3 guards and driven even the bravest warriors back with its savage rage. By dawn, they said, nature would have delivered its verdict. But the court didn't know the wolf was Dominic Crowe, their missing king, trapped in cursed beast form for 6 months. And they didn't know that Nora, gentle Omega from old bloodlines, carried within her the only power that could break such a curse. By sunrise, everything would change. The condemned would become queen, the beast would become king, and those who orchestrated this execution would face a reckoning they never imagined. Welcome back if you crave fated mates, redemptive obsession, and a love fierce enough to burn down empires. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new here, because this story is only beginning. The grand court chamber of the Lycanthian palace had never felt so cold. Nora stood in the center of the polished marble floor, iron chains weighing down her wrists, their metal biting into her skin as she faced the assembled court. Above her, vaulted ceilings soared toward stained glass windows that cast fractured colored light across the scene. But the beauty of the architecture only made the proceedings feel more grotesque, like watching something sacred being desecrated. Nora Bellwyn. Marcus Vane's voice rang out from the throne, Dominic Crowe's throne, where the Beta Regent sat with an ease that made Nora's stomach turn. You stand accused of treason against the crown. Priceless artifacts have been stolen from the royal treasury, ancient relics, bound to the Crowe bloodline, irreplaceable pieces of our kingdom's heritage. The evidence points to you. Nora's voice came out smaller than she intended, trembling despite her efforts to steady it. I didn't take anything. I've served this palace since I was a child. I would never— The Omega protests her innocence, Lady Thorne interrupted, her sharp features twisted with barely concealed satisfaction. She sat among the council members, draped in silk and jewels that seemed excessive even for court. How predictable. Yet the artifacts vanished from a storage room you had access to. A room you cleaned just days before the theft was discovered. Half the palace staff has access to that room, Nora said, desperation creeping into her tone. I'm not the only one who— Enough! Commander Steele's bark cut through her words like a blade. The military commander leaned forward in his seat, his scarred face set in hard lines. We've heard your excuses. The evidence is clear. You had means, opportunity, and— His lip curled with disdain. Omegas have always been too soft, too easily manipulated. Someone likely used you as a tool, knowing you'd be too weak to resist. Chancellor Grey nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral, but Nora caught the glint of calculation in his eyes. A thorough investigation has been conducted. All paths lead back to you, Miss Bellwyn. We must think of the kingdom's security. Nora looked around the chamber, searching for a single sympathetic face among the assembled Lycans. She found a few servants standing along the walls, who had known her kindness when their children fell ill, guards who had seen her gentleness during her years of quiet service. But their eyes dropped when she tried to meet them. Unwilling or unable to speak against the powers that now controlled the court, Marcus Vane raised his hand, and silence fell like a hammer blow. The council has deliberated. The verdict is guilty. The words struck Nora like a physical blow. Her knees weakened, and only the guards flanking her kept her upright. Guilty. She was innocent, she knew it with absolute certainty, but guilt or innocence no longer mattered. She had been chosen as the scapegoat, the convenient target for a crime she didn't commit. However, Marcus continued, and something in his tone made ice form in Nora's veins. The crown is merciful. We will not execute you outright. Instead, you will be given a chance to prove your innocence through trial by ordeal. Nora's breath caught. Trial by ordeal, an ancient practice, supposedly blessed by the moon goddess herself to reveal truth through survival. You will spend one night, Marcus said, each word deliberate and cold, from sunset to sunrise, in the dungeon cell with the feral wolf, the beast that appeared the night our king vanished, too mad with rage to be reasoned with, too dangerous even for our strongest warriors to approach safely. He leaned forward, false sympathy dripping from his voice. If you survive until dawn, you will be pardoned completely, your name cleared of all charges. The moon goddess will have spoken in your favor. The court erupted in whispers. Even those who had condemned her seemed shocked by the sentence. The feral wolf had killed 3 guards who ventured too close to his cell. No one survived contact with that creature. This wasn't mercy, it was execution dressed in religious ceremony. You can't, Nora started, but her voice died as Marcus's cold smile widened. Justice will be served, he said, Take her to the dungeons. The sun will set in 2 hours." The guards gripped her arms, pulling her toward the chamber doors. Nora's feet stumbled on the smooth marble as reality crashed over her in waves. She was going to die. Not quickly, not cleanly, but torn apart in darkness by a cursed beast. Her screams unheard, her innocence never proven. As they dragged her from the chamber, she caught one final glimpse of the court. Lady Thorne smiled behind her hand. Commander Steele looked grimly satisfied. Chancellor Grey had already turned to speak with Marcus about other business, as if Nora's death was merely an item checked off a list. And Marcus Vane sat on the stolen throne, watching her go with eyes that held no mercy, no doubt, nothing but cold calculation. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, and Nora descended into the darkness that would be her grave. The dungeon was colder than Nora had imagined. A bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the weight of stone and earth pressing down from above. The air hung thick and stagnant, heavy with dampness that made each breath taste of mold, and something else, something ancient and wrong, like magic left to rot in darkness for too long. The guards led her down the final corridor in oppressive silence, their torches casting wild shadows that danced across walls slick with moisture. They passed cell after empty cell, iron doors hanging open on rusted hinges, revealing chambers that hadn't held prisoners in decades. Nora's footsteps echoed hollowly against stone worn smooth by centuries of use, each step taking her deeper into the mountain's heart, farther from any hope of rescue or mercy. Then they stopped. The final chamber loomed before them, and even the guards' hardened warriors who had seen battle and death hesitated at the threshold. The door was different from the others, newer, reinforced with bands of iron that glowed faintly with protective enchantments. The lock mechanism complex and heavy, and from beyond it came a sound that made every hair on Nora's body stand on end, a low, continuous growl that vibrated through the stone itself, part animal rage and part something far more disturbing. The lead guard inserted a key that pulsed with warding magic, and the lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. The iron door swung inward with a scream of protesting hinges, and the sound that erupted from within made even these battle-tested men step backward instinctively. It was a roar of pure fury, primal and terrible, the sound of something that had forgotten it was ever anything but rage. They shoved Nora forward, her feet stumbling over the threshold. She barely had time to register the cell's interior, the rough stone walls, the single guttering torch mounted too high to reach, the narrow window near the ceiling where the last blood-red rays of sunset bled through before the door slammed shut behind her with terrible finality. The lock engaged. The sound echoed like a death knell. "I'm sorry," one guard muttered through the bars. Thomas, the young man whose daughter Nora had sat with through fever 3 winters ago, singing soft songs until the child's breathing eased. "Moon goddess, forgive us. I'm so sorry." Then their footsteps retreated up the corridor, growing fainter and fainter until silence fell like a burial shroud, and Nora was alone. Not alone. Never alone. She pressed her back against the iron door, her hands splayed against its cold surface, as if she could somehow push through it, escape back into the world of light and life. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the near darkness, and for a moment she could only see the torch's weak flame and the crimson glow of the sape eyes, watching her. As her vision cleared, Nora saw him fully for the first time, and her breath stopped in her throat. The wolf was massive beyond comprehension, larger than any natural creature had a right to be. His shoulders would reach her chest if he stood, his body filling the center of the cell with coiled power barely restrained. His fur was the color of absolute midnight black, so deep it seemed to swallow light, but threaded through with silver streaks that caught the torchlight like captured starlight, giving him an otherworldly, almost spectral beauty despite his condition. But his eyes, moon goddess, his eyes, they burned crimson red, glowing with their own terrible light in the darkness. Not the natural gold of an alpha's gaze, but something curse-twisted and wrong. Madness flickered in those depths like flames, and as they fixed on Nora with predatory focus, she saw rage there, bottomless, consuming rage that promised violence and death. Silver chains bound him, running from a thick collar around his throat to all 4 massive paws, anchored to iron rings embedded in the stone floor and walls. The chains glowed with ugly purple-black magic that pulsed visibly even in the dim light, and where the cursed metal touched his flesh, it burned. Smoke rose from the contact points in thin, sickly streams, and Nora could see the wounds beneath terrible burns that wept and bled, the flesh around them infected and swollen. The wolf lunged toward her, and Nora's scream died in her throat as the chains snapped taut with a sound like thunder. He stopped perhaps 2 body lengths away, the enchanted restraints holding despite the tremendous force of his lunge. His lips pulled back from fangs as long as her fingers, yellow-white in the torchlight and stained with old blood. The growl that rumbled from his chest was so deep, Nora felt it through the stone beneath her feet, vibrating up through her bones. She should have fainted, should have collapsed in terror or started screaming for guards who wouldn't come. This was death incarnate, chained and furious, and she had 12 hours until dawn with nothing between her and those fangs except cursed silver and her own desperate will to survive. Nora's heart hammered so violently she thought her ribs might crack. Her breath came in shallow gasps that misted in the cold air. Every survival instinct screamed at her to make herself small, to press harder against the door, to pray the chains held, and that exhaustion didn't make her stumble forward into his range during the endless night ahead. But as the wolf settled back into a crouch, as his crimson eyes remained fixed on her with that terrible, unwavering focus, Nora's omega senses dormant for so long in her quiet servant's life suddenly flared to awareness. She saw past the snarling facade, past the bared fangs and the promise of violence. And what she saw made her breath catch for an entirely different reason. The wolf was trembling, not just with rage but with exhaustion. His ribs showed clearly through his magnificent coat. He was starving, slowly wasting away. The silver chains didn't just burn his flesh, they were killing him by inches, the curse magic in them, poisoning his blood, crushing his consciousness beneath waves of enforced madness. And in those crimson eyes, between the surges of rage, Nora saw something that shouldn't be there, something that made her heart break even through her terror. Awareness, consciousness drowning in chaos, someone fighting desperately not to lose themselves completely. This wasn't a feral beast. This was someone being tortured. This was someone cursed. Nora should have stayed against the door. Every rational thought screamed at her to press herself into that cold iron and remain there, unmoving, until dawn broke and guards came to find whatever remained of her. She should wait and pray the chains held, that exhaustion didn't make her stumble, that the wolf's rage didn't give him strength enough to shatter his restraints. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, as she watched the wolf's body tremble with pain and poison, as those crimson eyes flickered between madness and something desperately aware, Nora felt something rising in her that was stronger than fear. It wasn't courage, she was terrified, her whole body shaking with it. It was something older, something woven into her very bones by generations of Omega bloodlines, bred not for weakness but for a different kind of strength. The strength to soothe savage alphas, the strength to bring peace to chaos, the strength to see past violence to the wounded soul beneath and refuse to abandon it, even at the cost of her own life. She couldn't watch someone suffer without trying to help. It was what she was, what she had always been. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered, her voice barely audible in the stone chamber. The wolf's ears swiveled toward her, and his growling intensified. She swallowed hard and continued anyway. "I'm sorry you're in pain. I know what it's like being imprisoned for things beyond your control, condemned for crimes you didn't commit." The wolf snarled, lips pulling back farther from those terrible fangs. But Nora kept speaking, her tone soft and steady despite the tremor she couldn't quite suppress. "The moon is beautiful tonight," she said, glancing up at the narrow window where silver light was beginning to replace the sunset's blood-red glow. "Can you see it from where you are? My mother used to say, the moon goddess watches over all Lycans, even in the darkest places, even in places like this." The snarling decreased, just slightly. The wolf's crimson eyes remained fixed on her, but something in their depths shifted, the rage flickering, giving way for brief moments to something more aware, more present. Nora's gaze traveled across the cell, and she noticed details she'd missed in her initial terror. A water bucket sat just within the wolf's reach, but positioned awkwardly where his muzzle, constrained by the thick silver collar, couldn't properly angle to drink from it. And the Burns moon goddess. The burns were even worse than she'd first realized. The silver didn't just sear the surface. It had eaten deep into tissue, the wounds infected and weeping, some so old they had scarred over only to be burned open again by the cursed metal's constant contact. Her gentle heart broke looking at them. No creature deserved this. No one, regardless of what they'd done or who they were, deserved to be tortured like this. Nora made her decision before she could talk herself out of it. She pushed away from the door, moving slowly, deliberately, her hands held out where the wolf could see them. "I'm going to help you," she said, her voice steadier now, falling into the calm cadence her mother had taught her for soothing, frightened children. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." The wolf's eyes widened, his entire body going rigid with tension. Every muscle coiled tight, ready to strike. But Nora kept moving, kept talking, letting her Omega presence fill the cell, that innate calming energy that was as much a part of her as breathing, scented like warm vanilla and honey, designed by nature itself to soothe even the most savage alpha. She reached the water bucket, still just beyond what she judged to be his strike range, though the margin was terrifyingly small. Carefully, moving with deliberate slowness, she repositioned it to where he could actually drink without straining against the collar's cruel angle. The wolf watched her every movement, his crimson eyes tracking her with predatory precision, but he didn't lunge, didn't attack, just watched. Then Nora did something that defied every survival instinct, every rational thought, every warning her mind screamed at her. She looked at those terrible infected burns, at the flesh rotting beneath cursed silver, and she couldn't bear to leave them untreated. She reached down and tore strips from the hem of her gray dress, the fabric ripping with soft sounds that echoed in the silent cell. She wouldn't need fancy clothing to die in, and if she was going to die anyway, she would die trying to ease someone's suffering. That was who she was. Who she would always be. Nora dipped the cloth strips in the water, wringing them out carefully. Then, hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the makeshift compress, she took a step forward. Then another, moving into range, moving to where those jaws could close around her throat in a single strike. The wolf could kill her now. One lunge, one bite, and it would be over. But he went completely still. Every muscle locked in place, his body frozen in a tension that seemed almost painful. His eyes, those terrible crimson eyes, fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. Nora knelt slowly beside him, her movements gentle and deliberate. She reached out with the wet cloth, and when it made contact with the worst of the burns on his foreleg, the wolf flinched. A sound escaped him, not a growl, not a snarl, but a whimper. A sound of pure pain that carried in it something unmistakably, heartbreakingly human. "I know," Nora whispered, her eyes stinging with tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I know it hurts. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She worked carefully, tenderly, cleaning the infected wounds with a gentleness that had soothed countless fevered children and injured servants over the years. Her Omega scent grew stronger as her emotional state heightened, filling the cell with warmth and calm, wrapping around the tortured wolf like a blanket of peace he hadn't felt in 6 long months of madness and agony. And the wolf, the cursed, feral beast that had killed trained warriors, remained perfectly still, letting this fragile Omega girl tend his wounds with hands that shook but never hesitated, with a compassion that transcended species and circumstance and the certainty of death. In the darkness of that dungeon cell, something shifted, something that would change everything. As Nora's gentle hands worked across the infected burns, cleaning away poison and rot with a tenderness the wolf hadn't felt in half a year, something extraordinary began to happen. The crimson in his eyes flickered, wavering like a candle flame in wind, and for brief, precious moments, they flashed to gold, true alpha gold, the color they were meant to be. Inside the prison of his own mind, Dominic Crowe felt memories rising through the curse-induced madness like drowning victims gasping for air. Fragments at first, scattered and painful, but growing clearer with each gentle touch of Nora's hands, with each word she murmured in that soft, soothing voice. He remembered his name, Dominic Crowe, not beast, not monster king. Lycan King of the Northern Territories, ruler of an empire that stretched across mountains and forests, bearer of a bloodline 1,000 years old. He remembered the blood moon 6 months ago, how it had painted the sky the color of fresh wounds. The ritual his council had advised him to attend ancient tradition, they'd said, to honor the moon goddess during her most powerful phase. He remembered the ceremonial chamber deep beneath the palace, the circle of his most trusted advisors, Marcus Vane, his beta and oldest friend, Lady Thorne, keeper of ancient texts, Commander Steele, leader of his armies, Chancellor Grey, master of law and custom. He remembered the chalice of wine they'd offered him, blessed by moon priestesses, they'd claimed, how it had tasted strange bitter beneath the honey sweetness, wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd drunk it anyway, trusting them, trusting the bonds of loyalty and service that should have been unbreakable. Then the magic had slammed into him like a physical blow, dark and terrible, wrapping around his consciousness like chains more binding than any silver. The transformation had come involuntarily, his body shifting to wolf form despite his attempts to resist, and then it hadn't stopped. The beast had risen, consciousness drowning beneath waves of rage and instinct, his humanity sinking deeper and deeper until there was nothing left but endless fury and the taste of blood and the burning agony of silver against his flesh. They cursed him, his own council, the Lycans he'd trusted with his life, with his kingdom. They'd worked together to remove their king and seize his power. The realization cut through the curse's fog with crystalline clarity. They couldn't simply kill him. Blood magic would reveal that crime, would mark the murderers for all to see, would demand vengeance from every loyal subject. But cursing him into permanent beast form, letting him fade into madness while they ruled in his absence, spreading rumors that their king had abandoned them or died in the wilderness. Perfect, untraceable, and by the time anyone suspected the truth, it would be too late. Dominic tried to speak, to force words through a throat that had forgotten how to form them. But all that emerged was a growl, low and frustrated, that made Nora's hands still and pull back slightly. No, don't stop, don't fear me. I'm not just... He struggled against the curse with everything he had, fighting the magic that bound his consciousness as securely as the silver bound his body. The effort left him trembling, exhausted, his vision blurring as the curse fought back, trying to drag him down into mindless rage again. But then Nora's voice cut through the darkness, soft and filled with wonder. "You're still in there," she said, her hands returning to his wounds despite her obvious fear. "You're not just a beast. You're fighting to remember who you are, aren't you?" Dominic managed the smallest movement, a nod, barely perceptible, but clear and deliberate. A conscious gesture that no feral creature could make. Nora's breath caught, and her eyes warm brown, gentle as summer earth, widened with understanding. "Moon goddess," she whispered. "What did they do to you?" She continued speaking, her voice growing stronger as pieces fell into place in her mind. She told him about the palace above, about how the court had changed in the 6 months since King Dominic Crowe vanished, how Marcus Vane had taken the regent's seat with suspicious speed, how Lady Thorne suddenly possessed ancient texts she'd never shown before, how Commander Steele had consolidated military power, how Chancellor Grey had rewritten laws to favor the new regime. She spoke of servants who had questioned the official story and faced sudden accusations of disloyalty, of guards who'd wondered why the regent insisted on keeping the feral wolf alive rather than executing it. Wouldn't a quick death be more merciful? And found themselves reassigned to distant outposts. Of how anyone connected to the old Crow loyalists seemed to meet unfortunate accidents or, like Nora herself, face charges of treason. With every word, more of Dominic's humanity surfaced, breaking through the curse in waves. He recognized the conspiracy she was describing, saw it clearly now, the careful orchestration, the elimination of anyone who might discover the truth or question the new order. He understood that this gentle Omega kneeling before him, tending his wounds with such impossible compassion, was another victim of the same traitors who had cursed him. They'd condemned her to die because she was too pure, too connected to the old ways of service and loyalty, because someone like her might eventually sense something wrong, might speak against injustice, might remind others of what true honor looked like. But as Nora's scent warm vanilla and honey, Omega sweet and soothing, continued to fill the cell, as her presence wrapped around him like a balm against 6 months of agony and madness, Dominic realized something else, something that made his alpha nature surge despite the curse trying to crush it, something that sent recognition flooding through every fiber of his being. This Omega was his mate, the one the moon goddess had destined for him, the connection he'd waited his whole life to find. Her scent didn't just calm him, it called to something fundamental in his soul. Her touch didn't just soothe, it anchored him to his humanity like nothing else could. The way his beast had refused to harm her despite the curse's command to kill. The way her mere presence was breaking through magic that should have been unbreakable. It all made terrible, perfect sense. The traitors hadn't just cursed their king. They'd sentenced his destined mate to death, thrown her into this cell to be killed by the very bond that should have protected her above all things. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated the power of a true mate bond, and they'd underestimated the strength of an Omega, who looked at a cursed beast and saw not a monster, but someone worth saving. The deepest part of night had settled over the dungeon like a shroud, the moon climbing to its zenith beyond the narrow window, casting silver light in a single beam that cut through the darkness. Nora found herself exhausted, her back against the cold stone wall, her dress torn and damp from tending the wolf's wounds for hours. Her muscles ached, her eyes burned with fatigue, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. She should still be terrified, should still be counting down the hours until dawn with dread clenching her heart. But when she looked at the massive creature chained before her, she no longer saw a monster. She saw someone imprisoned by magic and cruelty. Someone suffering. Someone fighting with everything they had to break free from a curse designed to destroy them. The wolf moved then, carefully, dragging his chains with deliberate slowness to minimize the metallic sounds that echoed off stone. He pulled himself closer to where Nora sat, and then moving with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so large and powerful, he lowered himself to the ground near her. Not threatening, almost protective, as if his massive body could shield her from the cold that seeped from the dungeon walls. Nora's hand rose almost of its own accord, hovering over his massive head, her fingers trembling with something that wasn't quite fear anymore. The wolf didn't pull away, didn't snarl or show teeth. He simply watched her with eyes that flickered between crimson and gold. Waiting, she let her fingers sink into his fur. The mate bond slammed into them both like lightning. Nora gasped, her entire body going rigid as sensation flooded through her, not physical, though she felt it in every nerve and cell, but something deeper, more fundamental, a connection snapping into place that she'd never known was missing, like a piece of her soul recognizing its other half after a lifetime of searching. The Omega teachings her mother had shared in whispered bedtime stories spoke of this, the sacred link between true Alpha and Omega, that transcended choice or circumstance, that was written in the stars and blessed by the moon goddess herself. This was that bond, this impossible, undeniable connection. For Dominic, the sensation was even more profound. He felt it fully for the first time since his cursing clarity flooding through him like dawn breaking after endless night. The mate bond acted like an anchor, pulling him back from the edge of permanent madness, giving him strength the curse couldn't suppress. Her soul called to his, and his answered with a recognition so deep it made the 6 months of torture and rage fade to background noise. Mine, his alpha nature roared beneath the curse. My mate, my Omega, mine to protect, mine to cherish, mine to... Who are you? Nora whispered, her hand still buried in his fur, the connection between them growing stronger with each heartbeat. Dominic concentrated with every shred of will he possessed, fighting against the curse that tried to drag him back down into mindless beast. The mate bond gave him strength he shouldn't have strength. The traitors couldn't have anticipated when they designed their curse. They'd never imagined their cursed king would find his destined mate in the cell where they'd sent her to die. His body shuddered, muscles convulsing as he forced something impossible. For just a moment, one brief, precious moment, the wolf form flickered. The air around him rippled with magic, fighting magic, and Nora saw him, the man beneath the curse, tall, powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a warrior's frame, dark hair that fell in waves, though even in this glimpse she could see it was disheveled and matted, strong, angular features that spoke of noble lineage and generations of kings. And those eyes no longer crimson but burning gold, true alpha gold, looking at her with an intensity that stole her breath. She saw authority that commanded armies, strength that had ruled kingdoms, and something fierce and protective and utterly focused on her that made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. Then the curse slammed back with brutal force, and he was the wolf again, his body collapsing with the effort of that momentary transformation. But Nora had seen enough. "You're him," she breathed, pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. "You're the king, Dominic Crowe." The wolf Dominic managed a small nod, his gold-flecked eyes locked on hers with desperate hope that she understood, that she believed. "They cursed you," Nora continued, her voice growing stronger as understanding bloomed. "The same people who condemned me, Marcus Vane, Lady Thorne, all of them. They cursed their own king, and now they're eliminating anyone who might be a threat, anyone who might figure out the truth or question their authority." Dominic made a sound of agreement, a rumble in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, more like words trying to form without the ability to speak them. Then, moving with deliberate intention, he lowered his massive head and rested it in Nora's lap. The gesture was unmistakable, trust absolute, protection offered despite his chains, and something more, acclaim, recognition of the bond between them that went deeper than any curse could reach. Nora's hands trembled as she stroked his fur, running her fingers through the midnight black shot with silver, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of this impossible connection. Understanding washed over her in waves that made her eyes sting with tears. "The mate bond," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's why I can soothe you when no one else could. That's why you didn't kill me, even when the curse demanded it. That's why I felt compelled to help you despite every rational instinct screaming at me to stay away." She looked down at those golden eyes, watching her with such fierce devotion, such perfect understanding. "We're mates," she said. And though the word came out as barely more than a breath, it carried the weight of destiny itself. The word hung in the air between them, unspoken until now, but understood from the moment she'd first touched him. Mates, chosen by the moon goddess, bound by forces older than kingdoms or curses, two souls that had found each other in the darkest place imaginable, against impossible odds. And nothing, not conspiracies or curses or the certainty of death, could break what the goddess herself had forged. The sky beyond the narrow window was beginning to pale, the deep black of night giving way to the first hints of gray that preceded dawn. Nora had lost track of time in the darkness, hours blending together as she sat with Dominic's head resting in her lap, her fingers stroking his fur, the mate bond humming between them like a living thing. She'd begun to believe they might survive this night, that somehow the connection between them would be enough to... Without warning, Dominic's body convulsed violently. The movement was so sudden, so brutal, that Nora barely had time to pull her hands back before his head snapped up, jaws opening in a roar that shook dust from the stone ceiling. His eyes, which had been flickering gold for the past hour, blazed pure crimson again, brighter and more terrible than before. The curse had sensed what was happening. The mate bond was weakening the dark magic, Nora's presence giving Dominic the anchor he needed to claw his way back to humanity, and the curse would not surrender its hold without a fight. The madness surged back with terrifying intensity, flooding through Dominic's consciousness like a tidal wave of rage and bloodlust. He snarled at Nora, lips pulling back from fangs in a display of pure predatory aggression, and for a horrible moment all recognition vanished from his eyes. The wolf the beast took full control, and every ounce of progress they'd made through the long night disappeared beneath the curse's final, desperate assault. Nora understood with awful clarity what was happening. This was the curse's last stand. Either it would win permanently, trapping Dominic as a mindless animal forever, or it would break. There would be no middle ground. The wolf lunged against his chains with such tremendous force that the magical anchors embedded in the stone walls cracked audibly. Purple-black light exploded from the points where enchanted metal met rock, and Nora heard the sound of stone beginning to give way. She scrambled backward on instinct, her back hitting the cell wall, but there was nowhere to go in the small space. When those chains shattered and she realized with sick certainty that they would shatter, there would be nothing between her and those fangs. Nothing to stop the cursed beast from tearing her apart in seconds. Nora could scream, could call for the guards who waited somewhere above. They might hear in time, might come rushing down with silver-tipped spears and blessed weapons to kill the wolf before he killed her. But if she did, Dominic would die. The king would perish without ever exposing the conspiracy or reclaiming his throne. Marcus Vane and his co-conspirators would rule unchallenged, their treason forever hidden, and the kingdom would suffer under tyrants who had murdered their rightful ruler through dark magic and lies. The traitors would win, permanently. Nora made her choice in the space between heartbeats. She didn't scream, didn't call for help. Instead, she pushed away from the wall and did the most terrifying, courageous thing she had ever done in her life. She moved forward, directly toward the raging wolf. "Dominic," she said, and her voice, her omega voice, carried a command she hadn't known she possessed. Not loud, but resonating with power that came from the mate bond itself, from the certainty that this was her alpha, and she would not abandon him. "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me, and I am not afraid." It was a lie. She was more terrified than she'd ever been, every survival instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything except walk toward those snapping jaws. But it was also truth, because beneath the fear was something stronger, absolute certainty that this was her mate, and she would not let him fall to darkness alone. The wolf lunged at her, chains snapping with sounds like breaking bones. His jaws closed inches from her face, close enough that she felt the heat of his breath, saw every detail of those killing fangs. But Nora didn't flinch, didn't step back. She reached out with both hands and placed them on either side of his massive head, her fingers sinking into fur that was hot to the touch, looking directly into those crimson eyes that burned with curse-driven madness. "You are Dominic Crowe," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You are the Lycan King of the Northern Territories. You are my mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself, and this curse does not own you. It never did, it never will. The wolf snarled, fighting her hold. But Nora held on with strength that came from somewhere beyond her physical body. "Break it," she commanded, putting every ounce of her Omega power into the words, letting the mate bond flare between them like fire. "Come back to me, Dominic. Come back to yourself. I refuse to lose you. Do you hear me? I refuse." For a moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then Dominic's body went rigid, every muscle straining so hard she could see them standing out beneath his fur. The curse and the alpha waged war inside him, dark magic fighting against the mate bond, artificial madness battling natural connection, death struggling against the life Nora represented. The mate bond tipped the scales. Nora's scent, warm vanilla and honey, Omega pure and meant for him alone, wrapped around Dominic like armor. Her touch anchored him to reality, to humanity, to everything the curse had tried to steal. Her absolute faith in him, her refusal to abandon or fear him, became his weapon against the dark magic that had held him captive for 6 months. He fought with every shred of will, every ounce of alpha strength, every bit of his royal bloodline that had ruled for 1,000 years. The curse tried to drag him down, but the mate bond pulled him up, and Nora's voice was a lighthouse in the darkness, guiding him home. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the dungeon, with a sound that was equal parts rage and triumph, and absolute defiance, something shattered. Not just the silver chains, which exploded into fragments of glowing metal, not just the magical anchors, which crumbled to dust, but the curse itself, the dark magic that had bound Dominic Crowe in beast form for half a year, broke apart like glass struck by a hammer, dissolving into nothing, as the mate bond blazed between them with power that no curse could withstand. Dawn light streamed through the window, and in that first golden ray of sunrise, everything changed. The transformation was violent and complete, more terrible and beautiful than anything Nora had ever witnessed. She stumbled backward as Dominic's body convulsed, bones breaking and reforming with sounds that echoed off the stone walls like gunshots. His spine arched impossibly, vertebrae cracking and reshaping, and his fur began to recede, pulling back into skin that emerged pale and scarred beneath. The sounds were disturbing, wet and organic, the symphony of a body remaking itself. But what held Nora's attention, what made her unable to look away despite her racing heart, was the magic breaking. She could see it now, visible in the dawn light streaming through the window. Dark threads of curse magic that had wrapped around Dominic like a shroud, snapping one by one. Each thread dissolved as it broke, turning to black smoke that dissipated into nothing, until the last strand shattered with an almost musical sound, like crystal shattering, and the curse was gone. When the transformation finished, when the final convulsion passed and stillness fell over the cell, the wolf was gone. In his place, kneeling on the cold stone floor, surrounded by fragments of shattered silver chains and the dust of broken enchantments, was a man. Dominic Crowe in his true form. He was magnificent, powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a warrior's frame marked by muscle earned through decades of training in battle. His skin bore the scars of his ordeal, silver burns that had marked him deeply, though already they seemed to be healing now that the cursed metal no longer touched his flesh. His dark hair fell past his shoulders in tangled waves threaded with silver at the temples, and his features were strong and angular, carrying the unmistakable stamp of royal lineage. But it was his eyes that made Nora's breath stop in her throat. Gold, pure, molten gold, burning with an intensity that was fully human now, fully aware, and fixed on her with a focus that made her feel like she was the only thing in existence that mattered. "You saved me," Dominic said, and his voice was rough from 6 months without human speech, raw and gravelly, but carrying unmistakable authority beneath it, the voice of a king. "My mate, my queen," before Nora could respond, before her mind could even begin to process the enormity of what had just happened, Dominic rose to his feet. He moved with fluid grace despite his ordeal, despite his nakedness, despite the wounds still visible across his body. He radiated power, not the savage, uncontrolled fury of the cursed beast, but the focused, absolute dominance of a true alpha who had reclaimed himself, a king who had returned. He crossed the small distance between them in 2 strides, and then his hands were on her shoulders, pulling her against him with a gentleness that contradicted his strength. Nora felt the heat of him, the solidity of his body, the way his heart hammered against his ribs in rhythm with her own. "They will pay," Dominic said against her hair, his voice dropping to something dark and promising. "Everyone who cursed me, everyone who condemned you, everyone who thought they could steal my throne and murder my mate, they will answer for what they've done." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his gold eyes blazing with emotion too complex to name gratitude and fury and something fierce and possessive that made Nora's knees weak. "But first," he said, his voice softening, "I claim you before the moon goddess. You are mine, Nora Bellwyn. My mate, my omega, my queen. Do you accept this bond? Do you accept me?" Nora should have been overwhelmed, should have been paralyzed by the impossibility of it all. Hours ago, she'd been thrown into this cell to die, a servant accused of treason, worthless in the eyes of the court. Now the Lycan King himself stood before her, alive and whole and claiming her as his mate, offering her not just his protection but his throne, his kingdom, his very soul. But looking into those gold eyes, feeling the mate bond singing between them like a living thing, pulsing with power and certainty and rightness, Nora knew there was only one answer. There had only ever been one answer from the moment their souls recognized each other. "I accept," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I am yours, Dominic Crowe, and you are mine." Something blazed in Dominic's eyes, triumph and relief, and love so profound it made Nora's heart ache. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent despite the calluses and scars, and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss sealed the mate bond permanently. It wasn't gentle. It was claiming and desperate and fierce. 6 months of suffering and loneliness and near madness pouring into the connection between them, but beneath the intensity was tenderness, gratitude, and a promise that transcended words. This bond would last their lifetimes. It would make them stronger together than either could ever be alone. It was written in the stars and blessed by the moon goddess herself, and nothing, no curse, no conspiracy, no force in existence could break what had been forged in darkness and sealed in dawn's first light. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dominic rested his forehead against Nora's, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment, the simple miracle of being human again, of holding his mate in his arms. Then his eyes opened, and the king returned in full force. He took Nora's hand in his grip firm and warm and utterly steady despite everything he'd endured. Dawnlight streamed through the high window, painting them both in gold, and when Dominic spoke, his voice carried the weight of royal command. "Come," he said, turning toward the cell door. "We have a throne to reclaim and traitors to face." Dominic tore fabric from the discarded prison clothes that had been meant to cover Nora's body after the wolf killed her, fashioning a makeshift covering for himself. It was crude and barely adequate, but dignity came not from clothing but from bearing, and Dominic Crowe wore his sovereignty like armor as he took Nora's hand and led her from the cell that had been his prison for 6 months. Every step upward through the dungeon levels felt like resurrection. The spiral stairs that had carried Nora down to her death now carried them both toward justice. Guards stationed at various checkpoints froze when they saw them, first in confusion at the open cell, then in dawning shock as they recognized the man ascending from the depths. Their king, returned from the dead. "Your Majesty," one guard stammered, dropping to his knee so fast he nearly fell. Others followed suit, their faces pale with astonishment and something that might have been hope. "Rise," Dominic commanded, his voice rough, but carrying the authority that had ruled kingdoms. "Gather your fellows. Follow us to the throne room. Witness what comes next." The sight of Dominic Crowe walking through his palace scarred, barely clothed, but unmistakably alive and whole with a condemned Omega at his side, spread through the corridors like wildfire. Servants pressed themselves against walls, eyes wide with wonder and fear. Nobles emerging from their chambers for morning court stopped dead in their tracks. By the time Dominic and Nora reached the grand throne room, a crowd had formed behind them, and half the court had already assembled within, including the conspirators who had believed themselves safe. Marcus Vane sat on Dominic's throne, conducting morning business with the comfortable ease of someone who had worn power so long he'd forgotten it was stolen. He was reviewing petitions with Chancellor Grey at his elbow when the massive doors slammed open with a sound like thunder. The regent looked up, irritation crossing his features, and then every drop of color drained from his face as if his blood had turned to ice. Dominic Crowe stood in the doorway, backlit by morning sun, gold eyes blazing with an alpha's fury, alive, whole, and very, very aware. The throne room fell into shocked silence so absolute that the sound of Lady Thorne's sharp gasp echoed like a gunshot. Commander Steele's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. Chancellor Grey went rigid as stone, his face frozen in an expression of dawning horror. "Hello, Marcus," Dominic said, his voice carrying through the chamber with alpha command that hit every Lycan present like a physical force. All around the room, Lycans dropped their eyes in automatic submission to their true king, all except Nora, whose hand remained steady in his, her Omega nature immune to the dominance display. "You're in my seat." The throne room erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted questions over each other. Guards looked between their regent and their returned king, with confusion turning rapidly to understanding. Marcus surged to his feet, his face cycling between shock, fear, and desperate calculation. "It's impossible," Marcus blustered, his voice pitched too high, too desperate. "You're dead. The beast, the curse. There's no way. No way I could break a curse designed to trap me permanently in beast form?" Dominic's smile was sharp as a blade. "You're right. There shouldn't have been. You crafted it well, Marcus. You and your co-conspirators. But you made one critical miscalculation." He pulled Nora forward, tucking her against his side in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "You threw my mate into that cell, and the mate bond is stronger than any curse you could devise." Dominic didn't give them time to coordinate a response, to craft lies or mount a defense. His voice rang out with royal authority as he told the assembled court everything: the ritual on the blood moon 6 months ago, the poisoned wine, the dark magic that had slammed into him and trapped him in beast form. He spoke of 6 months of torture and madness, of silver chains and curse magic designed to destroy his consciousness while keeping his body alive but imprisoned. "They needed me alive," Dominic explained, his voice cutting through attempted interruptions. "Blood magic would reveal murder, but a cursed king trapped in beast form, slowly going mad in the dungeons while they ruled in his absence? Perfect. Untraceable." He turned to the guards. "Search the conspirators' quarters. You'll find the stolen treasury artifacts planted to frame Nora Bellwyn and justify her execution. She was condemned because she represented everything they feared: loyalty to the old ways, connection to families who had served the Crowe line for generations, the kind of gentle strength that might eventually make others question what had become of their kingdom." The guards moved immediately, loyal to their true king. Within minutes they returned with evidence: ancient relics wrapped in Lady Thorne's personal silk, hidden in Chancellor Grey's private study, tucked beneath Commander Steele's floorboards. The conspiracy unraveled like thread pulled from cloth. Lady Thorne broke first, her composure shattering as she fell to her knees and confessed in a desperate rush, hoping for leniency that would never come. Chancellor Grey tried to flee, and was caught before he reached the door, subdued by guards who had served under Dominic for decades. Commander Steele attempted to fight, drawing his weapon with a snarl, but found himself facing 24 loyal soldiers who moved to protect their king without hesitation. And Marcus Vane, who had sat on a stolen throne for 6 months, who had ruled with the easy confidence of someone who believed his crime perfect and undetectable, could only stand frozen as his carefully constructed lies collapsed around him like a house built on sand. Throughout it all, Dominic kept Nora at his side, his hand never leaving hers, his touch steady and warm despite the rage burning in his eyes. When courtiers began to whisper, questioning the Omega's presence, wondering why a condemned servant stood beside their king, Dominic silenced them with a single look that made the bravest warriors step back. "This is Nora Bellwyn," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "My mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself. Your queen. She saved your king when you all believed I was lost. She showed courage when facing death, compassion when confronting a cursed beast, and strength that broke magic designed to be unbreakable. She will rule beside me with the same grace and power she showed in that dungeon." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled court, his alpha dominance radiating like heat. "Anyone who questions her suitability, her worth, or her right to stand beside me can answer to me personally. And I promise you, after 6 months as a beast, I'm eager for the conversation." No one questioned further. The silence was absolute and unequivocal. The acknowledgement of a king returned and a queen claimed. Justice had come home. The formal coronation took place under the full moon. The same moon that had witnessed Nora's condemnation now blessed her ascension. The palace's grand ceremonial courtyard had been transformed, its ancient stone columns wrapped in silver and midnight blue silk, thousands of candles casting dancing light across faces that had gathered to witness history. The moon hung massive and luminous overhead, as if the goddess herself had drawn close to watch her chosen children claim their destiny. Nora stood at the center of it all, wearing a gown of midnight blue that seemed to capture starlight in its folds, matching the formal robes Dominic wore as he stood beside her. The crown of the Lycan Queen rested on her head, a delicate circlet of silver and moonstone that had belonged to Dominic's mother, passed down through generations of queens, now given to an Omega who had entered the palace as a servant and would leave the ceremony as its sovereign. The past weeks had been transformative beyond anything Nora could have imagined. Justice had been swift and absolute. Marcus Vane and Commander Steele were executed for treason, their deaths witnessed by the entire court as a reminder that no position, no power, could protect those who betrayed their king. Lady Thorne and Chancellor Grey faced permanent exile, stripped of titles and lands, sent to wander distant territories where their names would be forgotten and their influence reduced to nothing. Others who had been complicit in lesser ways, those who had turned blind eyes or remained silent when they should have spoken, faced various punishments ranging from loss of position to public censure. The court had been purged of corruption and rebuilt with Lycans Dominic could trust. Wolves whose loyalty had been proven through the dark months of his absence, who had questioned the official story even when it was dangerous to do so. And Nora, who had once believed herself insignificant, a servant meant to live and die in obscurity, had learned what it meant to be queen. She had discovered that her Omega nature wasn't the weakness others had claimed, but strength of a different kind, strength that was desperately needed in a kingdom traumatized by betrayal and conspiracy. Her ability to calm tensions when tempers flared in council meetings, to heal divisions between factions that had formed during the regent's rule, to soothe the traumatized and bring peace to chaos became invaluable as Dominic rebuilt his kingdom. She learned to command when necessary, her gentle voice carrying an authority born not from domination, but from the courage she'd shown in that dungeon, from the conviction that had broken a curse designed to be unbreakable. Dominic watched her navigate court politics and kingdom management with pride that grew deeper each day, with love that expanded to fill spaces in his soul he hadn't known were empty. The brutal alpha who had once believed he needed no one, who had isolated himself in his strength until it became a vulnerability his enemies exploited, realized that his Omega mate completed him in ways he never could have imagined. Her gentleness balanced his dominance, her compassion tempered his justice. Her courage, quiet but unshakable, inspired his own strength to reach heights he'd never achieved alone. Now, as the moon reached its zenith and the coronation ceremony approached its climax, Dominic stepped forward to address the assembled court. His voice carried across the courtyard with alpha command, but beneath the power was something softer, gratitude and wonder at the mate the goddess had given him. "Darkness and conspiracy nearly destroyed us all," Dominic began, his gold eyes sweeping across the crowd. "6 months ago, I was cursed by those I trusted most, trapped in beast form, my consciousness drowning beneath madness while traitors ruled in my name. The kingdom I had sworn to protect was stolen from me, and I was powerless to stop it." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But in that darkness, in a dungeon where both king and innocent were condemned to die, something impossible happened. The mate bond saved us. Dominic turned to Nora, taking her hands in his touch warm and steady. When he spoke again, his voice gentled, filled with emotion, too profound to hide. Nora Bellwyn was thrown into darkness to die. They locked her in a cell with a feral beast, expecting nature to take its brutal course. Instead, she brought light. She saw not a monster, but someone suffering. Not a beast, but a soul fighting not to be lost. She showed compassion when terror would have been justified. She offered help when survival demanded she protect herself. She refused to abandon me even when the curse fought back with everything it had. His grip on her hands tightened, through her courage, through her unshakable belief that even in the deepest darkness there is hope. Through her Omega strength, that so many mistake for weakness, she saved not just me, but all of you. Because without her, I would be lost still, mad and mindless in those chains. And this kingdom would remain in the hands of tyrants who valued power over honor, who saw loyalty as weakness and conspiracy as strength. The courtyard was silent except for the whisper of wind through silk and the distant call of night birds. Every eye was fixed on their king and the Omega who stood beside him. "You are my queen," Dominic said to Nora, his voice dropping to something intimate despite the hundreds watching. "Not because I claim you, though I do, before the goddess and all witnesses. You are my queen because you earned this crown in blood and courage and unwavering faith. You walked into darkness when others would have broken. You saw worth in a creature everyone else called worthless. You are my strength as I am yours. You are my balance, my anchor, My home. Nora smiled up at her mate, her king, her eyes bright with tears that caught moonlight like diamonds. She thought about the terrified Omega who had been dragged down dungeon stairs, condemned to die in darkness and terror. She remembered the moment she'd chosen compassion over fear, the night she'd tended a cursed wolf's wounds while her hands shook, the dawn when she'd refused to abandon him even when death seemed certain. One night had changed everything. One choice had revealed courage she hadn't known she possessed, power she hadn't understood, purpose she'd been searching for without knowing it. She had discovered that being an Omega didn't mean being weak, that gentleness could break curses and shatter conspiracies, that compassion could topple thrones and restore kingdoms. "And you are my home," Nora whispered back, her voice carrying just far enough for those closest to hear. "My Alpha, my King, my everything. We are stronger together than either of us could ever be alone." Dominic pulled her close then, sealing their bond before the court and the moon goddess with a kiss that spoke of promises kept and futures claimed. When they broke apart, he placed his hand over hers on the hilt of the ceremonial sword that symbolized her new authority, and together they raised it toward the moon. The court erupted in celebration, cheers and howls rising toward the night sky, a sound of joy and relief and hope that had been absent from the kingdom for too long. They celebrated their returned king and their new queen, the couple who had survived conspiracy and curse, who had found each other in the darkest place imaginable and emerged stronger for it. As the celebration continued around them, as their people danced and sang under the blessing of the full moon, Nora reflected on the truth that would define their reign. When the conspirators had locked her in that dungeon with a chained wolf, they had sealed their own fate. Because by dawn, the Lycan King was standing whole and aware and furious, and beside him stood the Omega Queen who had saved him, who would never again accept being seen as weak or insignificant, who would rule with compassion matched by iron will, who would help transform their kingdom into something better than it had been before darkness fell. The wolf in chains had become a king reclaimed. The condemned Omega had become a queen crowned, and together, they would build a kingdom where strength and gentleness were finally recognized as two sides of the same power, where courage came in many forms, and where the greatest magic of all, the mate bond blessed by the moon goddess herself, was honored as the foundation upon which everything else could be built. Their story would be told for generations, not as a fairy tale, but as truth, that in the deepest darkness, light can still break through, that curses can be shattered by bonds stronger than any magic, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in refusing to abandon hope, even when all seems lost, and that when they locked her in the dungeon with the chained wolf, everything changed. By dawn, the Lycan King was standing, and the Omega Queen stood beside him ready to rule. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.